Let me tell you a story about a marriage that had all the makings of a fairy tale, until it didn't. My name is Michael. I'm 42, a financial analyst by trade, and, until recently, a man who believed that love could withstand anything. But I suppose when you dig deep enough, even the strongest foundations can reveal their cracks. Clara, my wife, wasn't always this cold, calculating woman I've come to know. We met 12 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding, and I swear, she was the life of the party. Her laughter was infectious, her charm magnetic. She was the kind of woman who made heads turn, not just because of her looks but because of her energy, this boundless, sparkling energy that made you want to be near her. And, for some inexplicable reason, she chose me. Back then, I was a struggling junior employee, overworked and underpaid. I didn't have much, but Clara didn't seem to care. She said she loved my ambition, my determination to make something of myself. I loved her for her spirit, her drive, her ability to light up a room just by walking into it. We were a perfect match, or so I thought. Things changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, after we got married. At first, it was the little things. A sharp comment about my long hours at work, a sigh of disapproval when I forgot to pick up milk on my way home. I dismissed them, thinking every marriage had its ups and downs. But over time, the little things grew into bigger things. Her sharp comments became cutting criticisms. Her disapproving sighs turned into full-blown arguments. "You're never here," she'd accuse, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowing. "All you care about is your job." "Well, someone has to keep the lights on," I'd reply, trying to keep my voice calm. But deep down, I was hurt. Couldn't she see I was doing all this for us? For her? For our future? I didn't realize it then, but Clara's dissatisfaction wasn't about the milk, the long hours, or even my career. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to. The tipping point came a few months ago. I just recovered from a car accident, a nasty one that left me with a broken leg and a few cracked ribs. The doctor told me I was lucky to be alive. I expected Clara to be there for me, to support me during my recovery. Instead, she seemed distant, almost resentful, as if my injury were an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. "I can't do this anymore," she said one night as I lay in bed, my leg in a cast, my body aching. Her voice was cold, emotionless. "This isn't the life I signed up for." I stared at her, my heart sinking. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm tired, Michael. Tired of being the one holding everything together while you do whatever it is you do." She gestured vaguely, her frustration palpable. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but what was the point? Clara had made up her mind, and no amount of reasoning would change it. Our marriage was hanging by a thread, and I had no idea how to fix it, or if it was even worth fixing. The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was about Lisa, our 9-year-old daughter. Lisa was the only thing we seemed to agree on, the one bright spot in an otherwise bleak relationship. But even she could sense something was wrong. "Is Mommy mad at you?" she asked me one evening, her big blue eyes filled with worry. "No, sweetheart," I lied, forcing a smile. "Mommy's just tired." Tired. That word had become Clara's mantra. And maybe she was tired. Tired of me. Tired of our life. Tired of pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. I knew I should talk to her, try to understand what she was feeling. But every time I looked at her, all I saw was someone I barely recognized. The woman I fell in love with was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, and infinitely more distant. But then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Clara surprised me. Out of the blue, she suggested we take a trip to a hill station, a place we used to visit before life got so complicated. I was stunned, to say the least. Was this her way of trying to fix things? Or was it something else entirely? I didn't know what to think. But for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, fragile flame that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Little did I know, that trip would change everything. And not in the way I expected. I'll admit, when Clara suggested the trip, I didn't know what to make of it. It was so out of character for her, or, at least, the version of her I'd been dealing with lately. For months, she'd barely looked at me, let alone made any effort to spend time together. So when she brought up the idea of visiting the hill station, my first reaction was suspicion. Why now? I asked her, keeping my tone neutral. We haven't done anything like this in years. She shrugged, her expression unreadable. Maybe that's the problem, she said casually. I thought it might help us. I don't know, reset things? Clear the air. Reset things? Clear the air? It sounded like the kind of therapy jargon Clara usually scoffed at, but I wasn't in a position to argue. If she wanted to try, then so did I. All right, I said after a pause. Let's do it. Her face lit up with a smile that felt almost genuine, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe this was a turning point. Maybe she was finally ready to meet me halfway. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning. Well, Clara planning. She took charge of every detail, from booking the hotel to mapping out our itinerary. She was meticulous, almost overly so, and I couldn't help but notice the way her energy seemed to shift. There was a certain excitement in her voice when she talked about the trip, a spark I hadn't seen in years. You've been quiet, she said one evening as we packed for the trip. Aren't you looking forward to this? I am, I said, choosing my words carefully. It's been a long time since we did something like this. She nodded, her expression softening. Exactly. That's why it's important. Important. That word stuck with me. She was right. It was important. Not just for our marriage, but for Lisa too. She deserved to see her parents trying, even if things felt fragile beneath the surface. The drive to the hill station was surprisingly pleasant. Clara played a playlist of old songs we used to love, humming along to the ones she remembered. I found myself relaxing, letting the music and the crisp mountain air ease the tension I'd been carrying. As we climbed higher into the hills, the scenery became more breathtaking. Dense forests lined the winding roads, and every so often, we'd catch glimpses of the valley below, shrouded in mist. Clara seemed mesmerized, leaning out the window to snap photos and pointing out every waterfall and cluster of wildflowers. This place is beautiful, she said, her voice tinged with awe. It really is, I agreed, glancing at her. For the first time in a long time, she looked happy. When we arrived at the hotel, a quaint little lodge perched on the edge of a cliff, Clara was practically glowing with excitement. She insisted we head straight to the observation deck to watch the sunset, and I didn't argue. As we stood there, the golden light spilling across the valley, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, the weight of our strained relationship seemed to lift, if only for a moment. This was a good idea, I said, glancing at Clara. Thank you for suggesting it. She smiled, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I'm glad you're here, she said softly. It was such a simple statement, but it meant everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. The next morning, Clara woke me up before dawn, insisting we catch the sunrise from the summit of the hill. It's supposed to be incredible, she said, practically dragging me out of bed. We set off just as the sky began to lighten, following a narrow trail that wound its way to the top. Clara was full of energy, chatting animatedly about the view we were about to see. I, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up. My leg still wasn't fully healed, and the uneven terrain didn't help. Are you okay? Clara asked, glancing back at me. I'm fine, I said, forcing a smile. Just a little slow. She nodded, waiting for me to catch up before continuing up the trail. Despite my discomfort, I couldn't help but admire her determination. She seemed so focused, so driven, and for a moment, I let myself believe that this trip really was her way of trying to fix things. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A flicker of something in her eyes, a tension in her movements. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking as usual. I had no idea how wrong I was. The climb to the top of the hill was grueling, to say the least. Every step felt like a reminder of my limitations, my legs still healing, my body not quite the way it used to be. But Clara, she was relentless, almost impatient as she led the way. I told myself it was excitement, her eagerness to see the sunrise from the summit, but deep down, Something about her energy didn't sit right with me. When we finally reached the top, the view was breathtaking. The sun had just started to peek over the horizon, casting its golden glow over the valley below. The air was crisp, the kind that made you feel alive, and for a moment, I forgot about everything. The tension, the doubts, the pain in my leg. It was just Clara and me, standing together at the edge of the world. "Isn't it beautiful?" Clara said, her voice almost reverent. "It really is," I replied, genuinely awed by the sight. "Thank you for bringing me here. This was a good idea." She didn't respond right away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. When she finally turned to face me, there was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't awe or joy, or even the tired satisfaction of reaching the summit. It was calculated. "You know, Michael," she began, her tone light, almost conversational. "I've been thinking a lot about life lately, about how fragile it is, how quickly things can change." I nodded, unsure where she was going with this. "Yeah, I guess the accident kind of brought that into focus for both of us." She tilted her head, a small, almost amused smile playing on her lips. "Exactly. Life is so unpredictable. One moment, you're here, and the next, well, who knows?" Something in her voice sent a chill down my spine. I shifted uncomfortably in my wheelchair, my hands tightening on the armrests. "Clara, what are you?" Before I could finish, she stepped behind me, her hands resting lightly on the back of my wheelchair. Her grip was firm, almost reassuring, but there was nothing reassuring about the way she leaned in close to my ear. "Now," she whispered, her voice low and laced with something dark, "nobody can stop me from claiming your $3 million insurance." My heart stopped. The words didn't make sense at first, didn't register as real. But then, before I could process what was happening, I felt the wheelchair lurch forward. For a split second, everything slowed. The ground disappeared beneath me, the horizon tilting wildly as the chair tipped over the edge. I couldn't even scream. The air was knocked out of me as I plummeted down the rocky slope, the world a blur of jagged edges and spinning sky. I hit the ground hard, my body tumbling over itself, the pain sharp and relentless. Rocks scraped against my skin, and the sound of Clara's laughter echoed in my ears, chilling and haunting as it faded into the distance. When I finally came to a stop, I was sprawled in a shallow ravine, my body battered and broken. The pain was excruciating, but I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I was alive. As I lay there, gasping for breath, my mind raced. Clara had pushed me. She had pushed me. My own wife, the woman I had trusted with my life, had tried to kill me, for money. The thought was almost too much to bear, but the evidence was undeniable. Her words, her actions, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard voices, distant, but growing closer. A group of hikers had spotted me from the trail above, their shouts cutting through the haze of pain and disbelief. They scrambled down the slope, their hands gentle but firm as they assessed my injuries and called for help. I was rushed to the hospital, every bump and jolt of the stretcher sending fresh waves of agony through my body. But even through the pain, one thought kept looping in my mind. Clara thought I was dead. She thought she'd succeeded. And that's when a new kind of resolve took hold. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to make sure she faced the consequences of what she'd done. She thought she'd won, but she had no idea what was coming next. As I lay in that hospital bed, battered but alive, I made a decision. Clara might have pushed me down that hill, but she didn't realize I wasn't the kind of man to stay down. Not anymore. The hospital room was silent, save for the steady beep of the monitors and the occasional shuffle of the nurses outside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the painkillers dulling the worst of the physical agony, but doing nothing to soothe the storm raging in my mind. Clara thought I was dead. That singular fact reverberated through me, equal parts rage and disbelief. I had trusted her, loved her, built a life with her. And for what? So she could throw me down a hill for an insurance payout? The betrayal cut deeper than any of the injuries I had sustained. But as much as I wanted to wallow in anger and self-pity, I knew I didn't have the luxury. I had survived, and that meant I had a chance to set things right. I wasn't sure where to start, but fate seemed to take care of that for me. The morning after the incident, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. One of the hikers who had found me had retrieved it from the wreckage of my wheelchair and brought it to the hospital. The screen lit up with a familiar name, Clara. I stared at it for a moment, my chest tightening. What could she possibly want? Was she trying to feign concern? Or was she simply fishing for confirmation that her plan had worked? My curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. Michael? Clara's voice was sharp, her usual feigned sweetness replaced by an edge of irritation. Why isn't the insurance company calling me? It's been almost 24 hours. I almost laughed. The audacity of this woman, the cold, calculating way she spoke about my supposed death. It was surreal. But instead of giving her the satisfaction of a reaction, I decided to play along. "Oh, Clara," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside me. "The insurance company isn't calling you because I'm still alive." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically feel her shock through the phone. "What?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "You heard me," I said, a grim satisfaction creeping into my tone. "I'm alive, Clara. You didn't succeed," she stammered, trying to form words, but nothing coherent came out. I imagined her standing in our kitchen, her perfectly curated facade crumbling as the reality of her failure set in. How did you survive?" she finally managed, her voice trembling. "Let's just say your plan wasn't as foolproof as you thought," I replied. "And now, Clara, I know everything. I know about the insurance policy. I know about your motives. And I know exactly who you are." "Michael, wait," she said quickly, her tone shifting to something softer, almost pleading. "You have to understand it wasn't." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice hard. "Don't insult me by pretending there's any justification for what you did. You tried to kill me, Clara. You tried to kill me for money." I heard her inhale sharply, but she didn't say anything. Maybe she was trying to come up with an excuse, or maybe she realized there was no way to spin this. Either way, I didn't care. "The police will be contacting you soon," I continued. "I've already filed a report, and I've given them everything they need. There's no way out of this, Clara. You've lost." For a moment, the only sound was her breathing, shallow and erratic. Then, finally, she spoke. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice venomous. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "No, Clara," I said, my tone calm. "The only one who's going to regret anything is you." I hung up before she could respond, my hand trembling slightly as I set the phone down. The conversation had been draining, but it had also been cathartic. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was taking control. Over the next few hours, I met with the police, recounting every detail of Clara's betrayal. I handed over the evidence I had gathered, phone records, her cryptic remarks leading up to the trip, even the hikers' statements about what they had seen and heard. The case against her was airtight, and the officers assured me they would move quickly. By the time evening rolled around, I felt an odd sense of relief. Clara had underestimated me, thinking I was too weak, too trusting to ever stand up to her. But she was wrong. I had survived her worst, and now it was her turn to face the consequences. As I lay back in the hospital bed, the faint hum of activity around me, I realized something profound. Clara's actions had freed me. Her betrayal, as devastating as it was, had shattered the illusion of the life we had built together. And while it hurt to see it all crumble, I knew I was better off without her. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The bruises and cuts on my body were a constant reminder of Clara's betrayal, but they also fueled my determination. The hospital staff had been kind, ensuring I had everything I needed, but I was restless. I didn't just want to recover, I wanted justice. As I sat in bed, sipping the lukewarm coffee the nurse had brought me, my phone buzzed. This time, it wasn't Clara. It was the police. The officer I had spoken to the previous day, Detective Ramirez, had an update for me. "We've issued a warrant for Clara's arrest," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Based on the evidence you provided and her phone records, We have enough to detain her for attempted murder. I exhaled, a weight lifting off my chest. Thank you, detective, I said. I want this to end. It will, he assured me. We'll handle everything from here. You focus on your recovery. But focusing on recovery wasn't easy. My mind kept drifting back to Clara, imagining her reaction when the police showed up at the door. Would she try to play the victim, weaving some elaborate tale to save herself? Or would she finally drop the act and show the world the cold, calculating person she truly was? The thought of her scrambling to explain herself brought a grim sense of satisfaction. For years, I had been the one scrambling to please her, to fix our marriage, to be the man she wanted me to be. But now, the roles were reversed. She was the one who would have to face the consequences of her actions. A few hours later, I got another call, this time from Clara's sister, Olivia. "Michael, what's going on?" she asked, her voice frantic. "The police just showed up at Clara's house. She's been arrested." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Olivia, I'm sorry you had to get dragged into this, but Clara, she tried to kill me." "What?" Olivia's voice cracked, disbelief lacing her words. "Michael, that can't be true. Clara loves you." I laughed bitterly. She loves me? Is that why she pushed me off a hill and tried to cash in on my life insurance? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I don't know what to say," Olivia whispered. "She never said anything. I thought you two were just having a rough patch." "A rough patch doesn't involve attempted murder," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "I know she's your sister, but you need to understand, Clara isn't who you think she is." Olivia didn't respond immediately, and I wondered if she was processing everything or simply didn't believe me. Either way, I didn't have the energy to convince her. "Look," I said finally, softening my tone, "I know this is hard for you to hear, but I can't keep explaining myself. Clara made her choices, and now she has to live with them." I ended the call, my hands shaking slightly as I set the phone down. It wasn't easy, cutting off someone who had once been part of my life. But Clara's betrayal had taught me an important lesson. Not everyone deserves a second chance. Later that day, I received another update from Detective Ramirez. Clara had denied everything at first, claiming the incident on the hill was an accident. But when confronted with the hiker's statements and her phone records, she had crumbled. "She's blaming the stress of your marriage," Ramirez said. "Says she wasn't thinking clearly, that it was a moment of weakness." I shook my head, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "A moment of weakness doesn't involve a premeditated plan to murder your husband for money," I said. "Agreed," Ramirez replied. "We've filed the charges, and she'll be held until her court date. You won't have to deal with her directly anymore." The relief I felt was immediate, though it was tinged with sadness. This wasn't how I had envisioned my life turning out. I never wanted to see Clara behind bars, never wanted to think of her as a criminal. But she had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. As I lay in bed that night, staring out the window at the city lights, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, yes, and sadness too. But there was also a spark of something I hadn't felt in years, hope. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't weighed down by Clara's constant criticisms or manipulations. I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to avoid another fight. I was free to rebuild my life, free to focus on myself, and free to find happiness on my own terms. The tables had turned, and this time, I was the one holding the cards. The day Clara was arrested, I imagined her world crumbling piece by piece. I wasn't there to see it, but the image played vividly in my mind. The knock on the door, the polite yet firm tone of the officers as they informed her of the charges, and the flash of panic in her eyes when she realized the walls were closing in. Clara was always the one in control, or so she believed. But now, that illusion was shattered. By the next morning, the story had already spread through our social circles. A friend of mine, who worked at the courthouse, texted me updates about her arraignment. The charges, attempted murder, premeditated conspiracy, were enough to make her bail exorbitant. Clara wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, I felt a strange hollowness. This was the woman I had once loved, The woman I had built a life with, now reduced to a headline and a court case. But whatever sympathy lingered was quickly squashed when I reminded myself of her laughter echoing in my ears as I tumbled down that hill. No, Clara deserved every bit of what was coming to her. A few days after her arrest, Olivia called again. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Michael," she said, her voice subdued. I don't understand. Clara's saying this is all a misunderstanding, that you've twisted things." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Olivia, do you really believe that? Do you think I would go through all of this? File a police report, provide evidence, just to ruin her? She pushed me off a hill, Olivia. She left me to die." There was a long silence before Olivia spoke again, her voice trembling. I don't know what to believe anymore. She was always so sure of herself, so confident. But now, she's still trying to manipulate you, I interrupted. That's what she does. She's convincing. I'll give her that. But this time, her charm won't save her. Olivia didn't respond, and after a few awkward pleasantries, the call ended. I knew it wasn't my job to make her see the truth. Clara had fooled a lot of people, but the evidence was undeniable. Over the next week, more details about Clara's actions came to light. Her financial troubles, the extravagant purchases she'd made with the expectation of cashing in on my insurance policy, even the text she had sent a friend boasting about her plan. The police had pieced it all together, and it painted a picture of a woman who wasn't just desperate, but coldly calculated. Despite everything, part of me wondered if Clara ever truly loved me, or if our entire marriage had been part of some larger scheme. It was a haunting thought, one I tried to push aside, but it lingered in the back of my mind. Had I been blind, or had she simply changed over the years? When her trial date was announced, I prepared myself for the possibility of seeing her again. The idea made my stomach turn, but I knew I had to face her. I owed it to myself to see this through, to ensure she couldn't twist the narrative in her favor. But Clara didn't make it easy. True to form, she tried every trick in the book. She played the victim, blaming me for her actions and claiming she had been driven to desperation by our broken marriage. She shed tears on the witness stand, weaving a tale of a woman who had simply made a mistake in a moment of weakness. It didn't work. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through her facade. When the guilty verdict was read, Clara's mask finally cracked. The confident, composed woman I had known was replaced by someone desperate and defeated. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with no chance of parole for at least 7. As the guards led her away, she cast one final look in my direction. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was something else. Regret, maybe. Or perhaps she was just calculating her next move. Either way, it didn't matter. Clara's downfall was complete, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. In the weeks that followed Clara's sentencing, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the trial, the end of a marriage I once believed in. It was a lot to process. Sometimes, it felt like I was living someone else's life, like this kind of drama couldn't possibly be mine. But then, every ache in my body reminded me of the hill, the wheelchair, and her chilling laughter. This was my reality, and I had to learn to live with it. I thought about Clara often, not because I missed her, but because I was trying to piece together how it had all gone so wrong. I had spent over a decade with this woman, shared my hopes and fears, built a life with her. How could I have been so blind to who she truly was? Was it my fault? Had I ignored the warning signs? I replayed countless moments in my mind, trying to pinpoint when things had shifted. The truth was, Clara wasn't always this way. Or maybe she was, and I just didn't see it. Either possibility was unsettling. One thing was clear, though. Our marriage had been over long before the hilltop incident. The love that once connected us had been eroded by resentment, mistrust, and unspoken grievances. I wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. I worked long hours, often prioritizing my career over quality time. I didn't always pick up on her unhappiness, and when I did, I didn't always know how to address it. But no amount of marital strain could ever justify what she did. I also couldn't help but think about the financial angle. Clara had always been careful with money, too careful. sometimes. She'd fret over bills, plan elaborate budgets, and lecture me on unnecessary spending. But after the trial, I learned she'd been in debt for years, borrowing money from friends and taking out loans she couldn't repay. She never told me about it, probably because she didn't want me to see her as vulnerable. But instead of asking for help, she decided the solution was to get rid of me. It was sobering to realize how little I truly knew about her. Clara was a master of appearances, always projecting confidence and control. But underneath that facade was a woman who felt trapped and desperate enough to do the unthinkable. As much as I hated what she had done, I couldn't help but feel pity for her. Not forgiveness, she didn't deserve that, but pity. Clara had thrown away everything for a fleeting chance at money and freedom. Now, she had nothing. No money, no freedom, no future. Just a prison cell and a lot of time to reflect on her choices. As for me, I wasn't sure what the future held. I was still recovering from my injuries, both physical and emotional. Moving on felt like an enormous task, one I wasn't quite ready for. But I knew I couldn't let this define me. Clara had taken enough from me. I wasn't about to let her take my peace of mind too. Lisa, my daughter, was my anchor through all of this. She was too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, and I wanted to keep it that way. She knew Clara was gone and that things had changed, but I framed it as a grown-up problem she didn't need to worry about. For now, my focus was on giving her a sense of stability and happiness. My parents had been a tremendous support as well. They opened their home to Lisa and me without hesitation, providing a safe space for us to heal. I didn't realize how much I needed that. A place where I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder or bracing for the next fight. Their kindness reminded me that there were still good people in the world, people who genuinely cared about me. One afternoon, my father sat me down in the living room. He had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. "Michael," he said, his voice steady, "don't let this make you bitter. It's easy to close yourself off after something like this, to build walls around your heart. But that's not who you are. You're stronger than this." I nodded, his words sinking in. He was right. Clara's betrayal was a chapter in my life, but it wasn't the whole story. I had the power to turn the page and start fresh. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find small moments of joy again. Playing with Lisa in the park, reconnecting with old friends, even just sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. It all felt like a new beginning. My scars, both seen and unseen, were a reminder of what I'd been through, but they were also a testament to my survival. I wasn't sure where life would take me next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I had been to the edge of the abyss and back, and I was stronger for it. Clara may have tried to break me, but she failed. The hardest part of all this wasn't recovering from the injuries or dealing with Clara's betrayal. It was learning to move forward, to step into a future that no longer included the life I had spent years building. At first, the thought was paralyzing. Where do you even begin when everything you thought you knew has been turned upside down? But little by little, I started to piece my life back together. I stayed with my parents for several months after the trial. Their home, filled with warmth and familiarity, was exactly what I needed to heal. Lisa seemed to thrive there, too. She didn't ask many questions about Clara, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want to burden her young mind with the ugliness of what had happened. Instead, I focused on making her feel safe and loved. My mornings started the same way most days. A quiet cup of coffee on the back porch, watching the sun rise over my parents' garden. It was a far cry from the chaos I had grown accustomed to, and I savored the stillness. It gave me time to think, to reflect, and to plan. One day, as I sat there, my father joined me. He handed me a small envelope without saying a word. Inside was a check. Not a loan, he insisted, but a gift to help me get back on my feet. "You've been through hell, Michael," he said, his voice steady. "Take this and do something meaningful with it. Build something new." At first, I didn't know what to do with his generosity. But as the weeks passed, an idea began to take shape. I realized I didn't just want to rebuild my life. I wanted to redefine it. I wanted to focus on things that brought me genuine joy, things I had pushed aside during my marriage. One of those things was gardening. It might sound mundane, But there was something profoundly therapeutic about working with my hands, nurturing life from the soil. My father's garden became my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of planting, watering, and watching things grow. Lisa often joined me, her laughter ringing out as she chased butterflies or helped me pick ripe tomatoes. Eventually, I decided to turn this newfound passion into a career. With my father's gift as a foundation, I started a small landscaping business. It was humble at first, just a few clients here and there, but it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I was doing something that made me happy. Lisa became my biggest cheerleader, proudly telling her friends that her dad was a plant expert. Her joy was infectious, and it reminded me why I was fighting so hard to move forward. I wanted to give her a life filled with love and stability, free from the shadows of the past. Of course, there were setbacks. Adjusting to life as a single parent wasn't easy. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, nights when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. But each time I stumbled, I reminded myself of how far I had come. I had survived Clara's betrayal, the fall, the trial. I could survive this too. As time went on, I began to open myself up to the possibility of new relationships. It wasn't about replacing Clara or rushing into something out of loneliness. It was about learning to trust again, to believe that not everyone would hurt me the way she had. I met people slowly, cautiously, through mutual friends or community events. I kept things casual, focusing more on building friendships than seeking romance. It felt good to connect with others, to share laughter and conversation without the fear of ulterior motives. It reminded me that the world wasn't as dark as it had seemed during my marriage. Lisa, too, began to blossom. She made new friends at school, joined the soccer team, and even started taking piano lessons. Watching her grow into a confident, happy child was the greatest reward I could have asked for. She was my anchor, my reason for moving forward even when it felt impossible. By the end of that year, I had built a life I was proud of, a life that was mine. My business was thriving, Lisa was thriving, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The scars Clara left would always be there, but they no longer defined me. They were a part of my story, yes, but not the whole story. One evening, as Lisa and I sat on the porch watching fireflies, she turned to me and said, "Daddy, you're happy now, aren't you?" I smiled, pulling her close. "Yeah, sweetheart," I said softly. "I am." And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. News of Clara's struggles began trickling in about 2 months after her sentencing. At first, I thought I wouldn't care. After all, she had tried to kill me. So why should I waste even an ounce of energy worrying about her? But curiosity is a tricky thing. It has a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. A friend of mine from our old neighborhood called one afternoon, completely unaware of the situation. "Hey, Michael, you won't believe this," she began, her tone laced with intrigue. "I ran into Clara's sister, Olivia, and she was telling me about all the drama with Clara. Did you know she's been evicted from the house?" I froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Evicted? From the house I once called home? I wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed stirred something strange in me, a mix of satisfaction and sadness. "She's staying with Olivia now," my friend continued. "Apparently, she's broke and can't find work. It's all anyone's talking about." I thanked her for the update and hung up, leaning back in my chair as I processed what I'd just heard. Broke. Jobless. Evicted. Clara had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to control every situation. Now, all that control was gone. The image of her sitting in Olivia's guest room, surrounded by boxes of her belongings, was almost poetic. But the more I thought about it, the less satisfaction I felt. Yes, Clara deserved to face the consequences of her actions, but this wasn't just about punishment. It was about breaking free from her manipulations, her control, her toxic influence. And that freedom didn't come from reveling in her downfall. It came from focusing on my own life. Still, there were moments when I couldn't help but wonder what Clara was thinking. Did she regret what she had done? Did she sit there, replaying her decisions, wishing she had chosen a different path? Or was she still trying to convince herself that she was the victim, that I was the villain in her story? The truth was, I'd never know. And that was okay. My energy wasn't meant to be spent on Clara anymore. It was meant for me, for Lisa, for the life I was building. Speaking of Lisa, she was adjusting remarkably well to our new normal. She asked about Clara less and less, and when she did, her questions were simple, almost indifferent. "Why doesn't Mommy call anymore?" she asked one evening as we were setting the table for dinner. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Well," I said carefully, "sometimes grown-ups make choices that take them away from the people they love. But that doesn't mean you're not important, okay?" She nodded, accepting my answer without further questions. It amazed me how resilient she was, how quickly she adapted to change. It was a reminder that kids are often stronger than we give them credit for. As for me, I continued to focus on the things that brought me peace. My landscaping business was thriving, and I found joy in the little moments. Planting a new garden for a client, watching Lisa's soccer games, spending quiet evenings on the porch with a cup of tea. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. Occasionally, I'd hear more updates about Clara. Apparently, she had tried to get a job at a high-end boutique, but was turned away when the manager recognized her from the news. She had also reached out to a few of our mutual friends, hoping for support, but most of them had distanced themselves after learning the full story. It wasn't long before I stopped hearing about her altogether. Clara had become a ghost, a figure from my past that no longer held any power over me. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found myself thinking about her less and less. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. Clara's struggles were hers to bear, not mine. I had my own life to live, and I wasn't about to let her shadow linger any longer. Lisa joined me on the porch, her laughter filling the air as she recounted a funny story from school. I smiled, soaking in the sound of her happiness. This was what mattered. This was what life was about. Clara's downfall was a chapter one would never forget. But it was just that, a chapter. My story was far from over, and I was determined to write it on my own terms.